Okay, now we're going to switch times. We're going to go back in time. This week's presentation, Ben Franklin reports on his successful mission to France with Steve Nousen. We're in for a great treat. Today we are going to travel through place and time. The place is the State House in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The time is July 2nd, 1785, and we are a part of this talk. We are all citizens of Philadelphia. We are in this setting to listen to the city's most notable resident, Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Dr. Franklin has just returned from Paris, where he spent 9 years as the representative of our new Congress before the court of King Louis XVI and his beautiful Queen Marie Antoinette. Because many are new to this city, you may not know Dr. Franklin personally, but you certainly know of him. Due to his inventions and scientific discoveries, he is America's first international celebrity. He was already famous here in the former British colonies as the writer of the popular Poor Richard's Almanac and was one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence. The fact is, there is a good chance you know him only by reputation, for Dr. Franklin has spent 24 of the last 28 years in both England and France on diplomatic missions. Today, Dr. Franklin is in ill health, but I am told he has been invigorated by his latest voyage across the Atlantic. Personally, I think he looks very well for a man approaching his 80th birthday in January. Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of Philadelphia, all, please welcome Dr. Benjamin Franklin back home again.
My dear friends, it's so good to be home. As you know, I have been in France for the past 9 years. Thank you for coming out today to hear recollections of my diplomatic mission. Because I am an old man and may be subject to the forgetfulness that comes with age, and because old men are sometimes subject to running on at great length, I have written a short speech. Because I am an old man and can't have long to live, I can be and will be very frank and open with you on a number of topics. When I have completed my prepared remarks, I look forward to engaging in dialogue with you. Since my return, I have noticed significant changes. Gone are the British troops and government officials. Gone, too, are the so-called loyalists, including my traitorous son, William, and my erstwhile friend, Joseph Galloway. They have gone to London. But gone also are many of our brave friends and neighbors who died in battle or of natural causes. In their place are thousands of immigrants who crowd our streets and are speaking a dozen different languages. As I walk on the streets of Philadelphia, I must wonder if I am not still in a foreign land. Now that we have won our independence, we must put our differences behind us and go about the business of building a strong new nation. Some of you will recall that we declared our independence from Great Britain right here in the State House exactly 9 years ago today. By late October of '76, we had exhausted all avenues to reconcile with our imperial rulers. I left Philadelphia with my 2 grandsons, Temple and Benny. The boys and I boarded a ship bound for an unknown destination. 5 weeks later, after the most perilous of my 8 crossings of the Atlantic, we landed in France. The Continental Congress had sent me to Paris on a diplomatic mission of the utmost importance to our country. I was joined in Paris by 2 would-be diplomats, and our only duty was to secure a financial and military alliance with the Kingdom of France. The would-be diplomats were Mr. Arthur Lee and Mr. John Adams. I was just days short of my 71st birthday when I arrived in Paris. My health was poor, but I was eager to get to work. I had some hope of success because prior to leaving Philadelphia, I had 3 clandestine meetings with an envoy sent by France's foreign minister, Count Vergennes. Indeed, shortly after I settled into my suitable quarters in Paris, the foreign minister asked me to join him at the Royal Palace in Versailles. As most of you know, the art of diplomacy is more than meeting with kings and foreign ministers. Diplomacy requires adapting to the mores of the host country. For example, in America, it is important to look industrious. In France, it is important to look at ease. Neither Mr. Lee nor Mr. Adams was able to grasp this truth. They blundered their way through French society and hurt our effort to quickly acquire French aid. Arthur Lee is one of the Virginia Lees, a family which considers itself akin to royalty in that state. Mr. Lee made it abundantly clear he considers himself quite superior to Mr. Adams and me. Mr. Lee, for all his royal upbringing, should have known how to handle the duties of a diplomat. But he has an excuse for his bad behavior. He is stark raving mad. John Adams and I first met in Philadelphia in '75 when we were serving as delegates to the Continental Congress. In fact, the next year we were both appointed to the Committee of 5 to write the first draft of our Declaration of Independence. Of the 2 of us, Mr. Adams is the talker, who loves to hear the sound of his own voice. He is quick to judge and is very opinionated. 2 bad traits in any diplomat. Members of Congress made a large mistake when they assigned us to work as a triumvirate. When you appoint 3 men to be in charge of a diplomatic delegation, no one is in charge. We quarreled among ourselves, which led Foreign Minister Vergennes to question which of us spoke with authority. I found the situation to be unworkable and wrote to Congress asking to be relieved of duty if the structure of our delegation could not be altered. I am certain Mr. Lee and Mr. Adams felt the same way, and both were disappointed and angry when Congress appointed me to be our first ambassador to a foreign power. Now, I could get down to work. Minister Vergen and I met many times and turned our focus to defeating the British in America. It would take a massive investment on the part of the French to make a difference in our rebellion. And things were not going well for our troops in the early stages of the revolution. Declaring our independence was the easiest part of our struggle to win our freedom. We had to fight the strongest army and navy in the world, and that would take money, lots of money. And money was in very short supply in our 13 newly united states. General Washington was constantly asking Congress for more money, more weapons, more soldiers, more food and clothing to field his army. Congress and General Washington were depending on my diplomacy to convince the French that our cause was worth their investment of money, supplies, and direct military aid. We needed the French far more than they needed us. Minister Vergen had to convince only one man to assist us, and that man was King Louis, who was very cautious about going to war. His kingdom had gone to war with England 4 times in the last 80 years, and he was reluctant to go to war again, especially if it was to aid a group of democratic rebels fighting another absolute monarchy across a vast ocean. Minister Vergen was successful in convincing his king to provide at least limited aid in the first years of our rebellion. I did not spend all of my time trying to win the favor of Minister Vergen. As I have said, the art of diplomacy is more than meeting with foreign ministers. Again, diplomacy is an art, and it requires adapting to the mores of the host country. In this case, it was in the salons of Paris at which much of my diplomatic work was done. Have you noticed that there is something about power and celebrity that attracts women? I must say, I was the most celebrated American in the world during my time in Paris. And I used my celebrity to our advantage. I was invited to the salons and soirees given by the wives and widows of the most important and powerful men in France. Much has been rumored about my interactions with the ladies of France. And I readily admit I encouraged their attention. My embrace of the ladies was not entirely for my own pleasure. It was a requirement of my job. I was adapting to the mores of France. One of my colleagues, the man of some renown from Massachusetts, found my behavior to be scandalous and reported that some nights I did not return to our compound until nearly midnight. That Puritan tried to impose the mores of Boston on Paris. How foolish. The person I speak of is, of course, Mr. Adams. John Adams. I am persuaded that he means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, a river. We were also granting rights to fish for cod off the coast of Newfoundland, which is a provision of great importance to our New England states where our rebellion was born. My dear friends, I'm growing weary, but I have enough strength left to answer a few questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. I'm going to take questions from the audience. Dr. Franklin is going to answer them, as Dr. Franklin is only can be himself, so we can only ask them relative to him. Who would like to ask a question? Yes.
Right. Let me do it. Dr. Franklin, thank you for your report.
I'd prefer you if you don't mind. Indulge me.
Dr. Franklin, thank you for your report. Is it true that your arrival in France, you were recognized as one of the leading scientists in the world? And what was that for?
Well, I was in fact recognized not only on my arrival in France, but upon my arrival in England in 1757. I was recognized as one of the great contributors to science, particularly in the field of experimentation in electricity. The British admitted me to the Copley, the Royal Society, and they gave me their highest honor, the Copley Medal. So it was well known what I had done at that point in time. I would like to say one more thing, because I always had an interest in science, and it continues to this day. The glasses I am wearing, the spectacles, solve one of the big problems we have, and that is needing to see in a far distance using spectacles and needing to read up close with other spectacles, instead of taking one off and putting one on and so forth. These double spectacles, which I have not yet perfected, allow me to only need one pair of spectacles. That's an example of what and also I have to say that my interest in science is more than what I have done. While I was in Paris after the treaty was signed, and before Congress chose to call me home, I saw men flying in Paris in lighter-than-air balloons. It was the most fascinating thing I had seen. These men in these baskets flying up above the crowd. As I was sitting in my carriage and watching this happen, a man said to me, "Oh, what's the big deal? There's nothing important happening here." And I answered, "How important is a newborn baby? I can see the time when we have enough of these balloons that we'll be able to put soldiers in balloons and fly them over enemy lines and have them land and attack the enemy from the rear. That's the kind of thing that science provides us. And I just can't wait to see what will happen in the few months or years I have remaining. Thank you for your question.
Anybody else?
Dr. Franklin, what was your relationship with Thomas Jefferson and what was he doing during his time?
My relationship with Thomas Jefferson, what a wonderful man, Thomas Jefferson. What an enlightened thinker. I first met Mr. Jefferson. He was much my junior at the Second Continental Congress. But he had been educated at the College of William and Mary, and he knew so much and was such a gifted man, but very shy, very reserved. And he served with the Committee of Five, of which he was a member, as the author of our Declaration of Independence. Now, during that time, he permitted Mr. Adams and me to try to make some additions or corrections as we could help to make it a more perfect document. And I offered one or two suggestions that I thought might be significant. Mr. Adams, in his infinite wisdom, offered many suggestions, some of which were taken, most of which weren't. And then we had to submit the Declaration to Congress for its approval. And we did that at this day, 9 years ago. We approved on July the 2nd a resolution that these states are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Then we presented the document, and it took 2 more days of sometimes bitter debate to work out the differences between the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. Items that Mr. Jefferson and I and Frank and Adams had worked over were thrown out. And Jefferson just shook his head. How can they take these words and not accept them? But he said it only, quietly, to me. Mr. Adams was on his feet constantly arguing one way or the other. But Mr. Jefferson and I allowed the Congress to move forward at their own pace. 2 days later, we had reached the compromises that had to be agreed to. It had been put on paper, and we had assembled to sign the document on July 4, 1776. The document was left open, and some delegates didn't sign it until August the 2nd. Now, there are only 200 of these documents, original. If you have one, hang on to it. I think someday they may be very valuable. Also, Mr. Jefferson was the person who relieved me as the ambassador to France. It took Congress a while to decide on that, and Mr. Jefferson, who had lost his wife and was struggling financially, had some trouble in terms of extricating himself from his farm. But he did come, and he did show up. And the French asked Mr. Jefferson, "Is it true that you are the man who replaces Franklin?" And Mr. Jefferson was kind enough to say, "I am only the new ambassador. No one can replace Franklin." So I am always indebted to him. Ladies and gentlemen, the microphone is in here. I'm Stephen Nousen, and I live just up Marcos Castellanos. My wife Casey and I have been here for 5 years, and we love Ahihi. It's a wonderful place and just so full of life and interesting people. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have that Franklin either couldn't or wouldn't answer.
Okay.
I was wondering if the diplomat, Lee, that accompanied you when you started your negotiations was, after a while, related to Robert E.
He wasn't. The question is, was Arthur Lee related to Robert E. Lee? The answer is yes. About 2 generations after that, there were 2 other Lees who were in the Continental Congress. One Light Horse Harry Lee, and I forget the other one. But Robert E. Lee was in fact related to Arthur Lee, and that's quite a family, a royal family in the state of Virginia.
Who else?
Love your Oregon Ducks, Ken.
Thank you.
I'm a native Oregonian, by the way, and a Ducks fan.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about his younger years, because I understand he was quite athletic, and we know most of what Franklin was in his 70s.
Benjamin Franklin was the 15th of his father's 17 children. And he was the youngest boy in his family. And as such, and as the 10th son, his father wanted to make him his tithe to the church. But Franklin would tell you that that didn't fit his personality at all. And he was far removed from any church activity going forward. In matter of fact, one of the reasons, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but yes, he was very athletic. And his first invention was, in fact, swim fins that were made out of wooden paddles that he could strap to his feet or his hands and try to propel him faster. He also loved the fact that he could go swimming in the pond and fly a kite and have that kite tow him across the lake. He was a very accomplished swimmer, but understand that the Australian crawl was probably 150 years in advance of that. So they were doing the breaststroke and the side stroke and those kinds of things. If he had been putting his mind to it, and if they had had the Olympic Games in that point in time, I think he might have been a good enough swimmer to qualify the Olympic Games. When he was in London, on his first voyage when he was 19, he stayed for about 18 months trying to perfect his ability as a printer. He jumped into the Thames and swam from somewhere to Blackfriars along the Thames. It must have been about 1.5 miles or 2 miles. One nobleman saw him and said, "Mr. Franklin, I need you to stay here in England and teach my sons how to swim." And he said, "I got to get home because there's a woman waiting for me named Deborah, and I have to go home." And so he returned home. That was his first and second voyage across the Atlantic. Again, he made 8 voyages across the Atlantic.
Did Franklin ever meet Washington?
Franklin did meet Washington. Franklin actually served in the Continental Congress briefly with Washington. Washington was a delegate to the Continental Congress for about a month or so when Franklin was there. And then, with the hostilities having broken out in Massachusetts, Congress appointed Washington to lead the Continental Army. And he went up and eventually put the blockade around the hills on Dorchester Heights, and that blockade drove the British out of Boston up to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia to get out of the way of the guns on Dorchester Heights. Franklin was assigned in 1775, shortly after that period, before the Dorchester Heights event, to go and make an assessment of the Continental Army. And he went up and was with Washington for more than a week behind the American lines, figuring out how much was needed in terms of money, supplies, food, clothing, all those kinds of things that Washington would continually ask for. They met then. They also met after Franklin comes back here into 1785. In 1787, they both served together on the Constitutional Convention. And there were only two choices to be the president of the Constitutional Convention. It was either going to be Franklin because of his distinguished career, or Washington because of his distinguished military accomplishment. Franklin, who was in very ill health in 1787, declined to take that position and wrote a magnanimous letter saying, I think that the Congress should unanimously select George Washington to chair the Constitutional Convention. He had great admiration for General Washington. And so Franklin was extremely ill during that time and had to be carried the 3 blocks from his home to the State House in a chaise lounge, basically. And during that time, the guys who took him there were prisoners from the jail. He could only attend a few of the meetings of Congress, but he acted at the Constitutional... I'm getting ahead of myself. My 5th appearance at Open Circle will be about the final days of Franklin's life. So I have to withhold a few things. But my good friend here asked me earlier, when did you die? Franklin died actually on April 17th, 1790. Wow. He was 84 years old. And he had real bad congestion in his lungs and could barely speak and was existing basically on laudanum, a morphine opiate. And, but he finally had so much congestion in his lungs he passed away. It's important to remember that at his funeral, the procession was very long and included clergymen from every congregation in Philadelphia, including the rabbi from the Jewish community. He was so loved, even though he was a man of ambivalent religious beliefs. And come back, we'll talk more about that. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about Benjamin Franklin and music? Because I know he did invent the glass harmonica, but now that I know how much time he spent in Europe, is there a chance that he might have met Mozart on Mozart's grand tours through Europe?
To my knowledge, Franklin did not meet Mozart, but both Mozart and Beethoven wrote music for the invention you mentioned, which is the glass harmonica. You know that if you take a wine glass and wet the rim, you're going to produce a sound, a tone. What Franklin did is took many glasses and stretched them out. They had various sizes on it, and he put a pedal on a spindle, and he would spin the glasses. And he had a tray in front of him where he would wet his fingers and he would move them like you would on a piano key. And Mozart and Beethoven both composed music for this new instrument, the glass harmonica. Another scientific invention of his.
Stephen, can you speak to a little bit of what you think Dr. Franklin would say to what's happening in the United States at this time in terms of anything you want to pick?
I would say this. Franklin was no stranger to a nation being torn apart. During the Revolution, his own son was a traitor to him because his son William was the royal governor of New Jersey, and he was remaining loyal to King George. His good friend Joseph Galloway also remained loyal, as did a third of the people in the colonies in those days. And historians tell us that perhaps a third of the people in the colonies were what we would call patriots. And the other third of the people waited to see what was going to happen before they took a side. Now, I'm somewhat familiar with revolutionary history in South Carolina. And I say this because in South Carolina, the people, especially the common people in the backcountry, did not have allegiance one way or the other. Most of the coastal people, like Lawrence, had a lot of investment in slaves and in rice plantations and in indigo. It was too early for cotton because Eli Whitney had not invented the cotton engine until 1790. And so it was mostly rice plantations in the low country. But in the uplands of South Carolina, the people were very proud and they were very clannish. And when the British invaded South Carolina, the thing that provided people's allegiance was who the British killed and who the Patriots killed. If you killed a member of my family, I was for the British. If not, I was for the other side. And that went on and on. The most battles in the Revolutionary War were fought in South Carolina, not in Saratoga, not in Yorktown, but in South Carolina. In fact, how did Cornwallis get to Yorktown? He had come from South Carolina, across North Carolina, into Yorktown, and was trying to, at that point in time, escape and get away. But we'd captured his army, thanks to the French mostly. So this third of the people who are in the middle, very aware, Franklin was very aware of that. To speak to your question, Kat, today in the United States you have 40% of the people on one side, and perhaps 40% of the people locked in on another side, and it's very, very polarized. Who are the 20% in the middle? People who don't care about what the government is doing, people who don't care about anything, they just want to be left alone, people who could go one way or another. Our country is divided. I speak as an American. Our country is divided, just as we were in the 1770s, between loyalists and so-called patriots. And I don't know how it's going to turn out, obviously. I don't.
So could you, I didn't get to give your bio. Can you give your bio and talk a little bit about the Smithsonian and what the hell you've been up to with this?
My career was as a public school teacher. I taught history and politics and government and things like that in Oregon, in Canby, Oregon, if anybody's interested. And I did that for about 15 years. And then I went to Washington to work for our Senator Mark Hatfield, who was a Republican, a liberal Republican, a species that no longer exists in the United States. I worked for him for about 10 years, including the last 5 years of his term. He spent 30 years, and I spent the last 5 years as his chief of staff. Following that, I went to work as a lobbyist for the National Education Association and lobbied for public school teachers around the country. But as I got closer and closer to retirement, I thought, what am I going to do in retirement? Well, I'll go and move to South Carolina and I'll play golf every day. And I thought, I got to do more than that. And so I sat down and made a list of things I liked to do and things I didn't like to do. And I found out later that that's a very Franklin-esque thing to do. Write down the pros, write down the cons, and measure them out. And so I would go back to these lists every couple of months and say, you know, I'd really like to do that. That's when I'm going to start. I want to make sure that I do something that I can have fun with. And this one over here, I never want to do that, you know. And sometimes things would cross over. I don't mind ever doing that again. But, you know, I might want to do that. And so I said to myself, said I could be Benjamin Franklin. As a history teacher, I knew that Franklin lived a long life. I knew that Franklin was fat and bald. And I might be able to, in fact, do that. And I started performing in and around Washington, later in other places. But I had a couple of gigs at the Library of Congress for the Reading Institute of the United States, and another at the Library of Congress, which was actually catty-corner to my office at the National Education Association. And those were wonderful experiences. I've also written a one-man play in 2 acts and lots of different presentations. But I love doing this from time to time, and I don't know. One more thing I'm reminded of, if I can. Franklin is a character for today. Someone this morning, Kat, wrote to me and said, are you aware of the Ken Burns thing on PBS, 4 hours of Franklin? And some of you have seen that, some of you not, but it's up and around and it's out there and available and it's pretty good. The other thing is that Michael Douglas has done a program for something called Apple TV Plus, and he portrays Franklin in France. So this program is about what we talked about today, and I'm going to be watching closely. Make sure you
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.